1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15 says, always be ready to make a defense to anyone who demands from you an accounting for the hope that is in you. Whether you encounter atheists, agnostics, lukewarm Catholics, people in your family, we want to deal with them. We've got some tips on how to handle yourself with the issues they bring up. So please stay with us. Thank you. Thank you very much and welcome. I'm Father Mitch Pacwa. Welcome to EWTN Live. We bring you guests around the world, and this one comes from the Republic of Texas. He is the founder and the president of the Aquinas School of Theology and Philosophy. This is devoted to teaching the Catholic intellectual tradition according to St. Thomas Aquinas and helping people understand complementary relationship between faith and reason. Faith and reason go together. And also, it shows how to intellectually, rationally defend the Catholic faith. There's a lot of work to do, and this gentleman is doing so. So just take a look at this, what he's done already in these videos he's made.
I grew up being Christian, but as I grew older, I kind of realized that a lot of it is not something that I believe in or really think it's true.
A lot of people today think that belief in Christianity is irrational, gullible, foolish, or even just plain weird.
I sort of tend to think of the Bible more as historical fiction.
I think it's just mythology.
I think it's weird.
We do live in a post-Christian age that is becoming increasingly hostile to religion and Christian faith.
Are we witnessing the fall of Christianity in America?
I personally cannot personally accept the fact that he's the Son of God.
Half of the Bible that teaches you to love your neighbor as yourself.
Perhaps as many as 16% of people now identify as having no faith of any kind, and that's double what it was a decade ago.
Faith, by definition, is believing in things without evidence, and personally, I don't do that because I'm not an idiot.
Religion is losing its influence in American life.
All right, that's a little clip from the video teaching series that was produced by our guest tonight. He is trying to bring old school Orthodox Christianity to the modern secular world where there's not much thinking or knowledge going on. So please welcome Dr. Scott M. Sullivan.
Thank you, Father.
Good to have you here.
Thank you so much.
You know, I was fascinated with both your series. You have one called Logic 101 and another on Christ 101. And I started off with the logic. It was great. I hadn't had Aristotelian logic in 46 years, 47 years. It's adding up.
You're never too old.
No, but it's good to remind of it, and you do a great, clear job. And then, of course, with the information that you are doing on Christ, in Christ 101, you're dealing with rational explanations for why we believe what we do. Have you always held to this clear ability to think well and defend the faith?
Well, no, I haven't. I have always kind of thought, I consider myself a really sort of rational person. And I was raised in a loving home, evangelical Christian home, but like a lot of people, when I got into high school, college, I fell away from the faith. I left Christianity entirely. I became an agnostic. That's someone who's, not sure if God exists or not.
Yeah, and again, I always sorry to interrupt, but I always like to remind people that the word agnostic is just a Greek word meaning not knowing. Right? That's where that'd be.
Right. Yeah, not sure if God exists.
Right. I usually stick with the Latin form of it, which means that people are bragging I'm ignorant, And proud of it.
I kind of was that.
Yeah.
Now, I didn't leave Christianity so much because I was this big, huge sinner, although, of course, I was a sinner. But primarily, it was because of intellectual reasons. I didn't see any good reasons to think that Christianity is true. I had never been given any growing up as an evangelical Christian. I kind of thought it was just a Santa Claus for grown-ups, you know. And so I left, and I stayed that way through high school, college. And then when it came time to graduate college is when things started to change. I was on the 10-year plan, you know, where you keep changing your major around. So I was like 30-something years old. Okay, I got to graduate now. Okay, well, what's going to...
I guess you weren't paying for the tuition.
No,
huh?
of course not. Right. So, but I felt like I needed to decide what I was going to do with the rest of my life now that I was going to quit being a professional student. And so that kind of brought this question, okay, well, what's life all about anyway? You see, so this kind of an event of graduating college sparked all these philosophical questions. So I embarked on this study, and eventually, one time I went into a Barnes & Noble bookstore in the religion section of all places, Father. And I know you probably know what the religion section in Barnes & Noble is like. There's all kinds of, you know, crazy things in there. But anyway, by God's grace, I walked up to the shelf and pulled off a book, a blue spine. I opened it up. It was the Handbook of Christian Apologetics by Peter Kraft and Ronald Ticelli. That book changed my life. I had never seen stuff like this before. Philosophical arguments for the existence of God, historical arguments for the divinity of Jesus Christ and the reliability of the Gospels. I was blown away, and I thought, man, if I had been shown this stuff as a child, I never would have left the Christian faith. And so I kind of decided at that point I wanted to make it my life's mission to help other people see the rationality of belief in God, the Christian faith, and so on. So that's why I went on to pursue a study in philosophy and conduct my apostolate now.
And you studied the philosophy, especially of St. Thomas Aquinas, which, of course, includes a lot of study of the Greek philosopher Aristotle.
Yes.
So you learned logic from him and metaphysics from Aristotle, but then St. Thomas kind of finishes that off.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, does that help you with some of this work?
Oh, St. Thomas Aquinas is tremendous. You know, he's been the most recommended philosopher by the church. Numerous popes throughout the centuries have recommended the study of Aquinas, both in philosophy and theology. And he's just tremendous because what he did in his time was he synthesized all of the great ideas of all the great thinkers prior to him. He kind of stripped them of all their errors and made a cohesive system that's coherent with reason and divine revelation.
That's one of the things, too, that's very important. St. Thomas uses logic and philosophy.
Yes.
But, you know, as I've said many times in these various programs, logic is a great tool.
Yes.
I compare it to a ladder. It takes you step by step in a straight line from point A to point B. But its usefulness depends on where you set it down. What's its basis? And Thomas was very much based in his Christian faith. And if you set your ladder up against a blank wall like atheism as a starting point, then it's going to lead you to a blank wall. 100%. But he opened it up. He set it down to an opening in heavens. If you truly, logic becomes a stairway to heaven. It's a way, if you start off with that basis. But your enterprise is something a little bit different. You're taking some very rational approaches to deal with people who deny the faith or doubt it.
Correct.
And you help them to see that it's far more logical to believe than not believe.
Yes, yes.
Does that approach work?
Yeah, it's very important, I think, for people to understand today that people don't always refrain from becoming Christian or Catholic because they have some hang up on some vice. That's obviously one reason, a moral reason, but there are also intellectual obstacles before coming to the faith. St. Augustine had those as well. So they don't become Catholic.
He did both.
He had both, right. And sometimes the intellectual obstacles can be like a shield to protect this vice that I want to hang on to. But what people need to realize is that a lot of people don't become Catholics because they don't think it's true. They see no good reason to think it's true. And that's where I was. And so I just thought, you know, there has to be a lot of people out there that was in my position, people who would become Catholic if they had good reasons. And so I wanted to do whatever I could to kind of, you know, promulgate all that information to everybody else.
What do you see as some of the really good issues with which to begin approaching somebody who does not have faith?
One of the biggest problems today, one of the biggest obstacles to someone accepting the gospel are philosophical hang-ups, bad ideas, false ideas about the world. For example, we have a culture today that is very enamored with science. There's nothing wrong at all with science, but some people take that too far. They'll exaggerate it to the point where they'll say only science can give us knowledge. That something is either scientific, that is to say it fits in the category of physics, chemistry, biology, or it's just pure bunk, blind faith. And that is not an adequate description of human knowledge. There are whole other areas of legitimate human knowledge. You've got philosophy, you've got historical knowledge. So you can't just put all knowledge in the science bucket, you know what I mean?
Right.
So that's a huge philosophical error that people have, and this is constantly promulgated by a lot of these new atheist type, people like Richard Dawkins and people like this. They have this idea either implicitly, but quite often explicitly. They'll say things like this. If it's not scientific, if I can't prove it with a test tube or with a science experiment, then therefore it's not true. It's just wishful thinking. It's blind faith. And that is simply not true. It's actually self-refuting. Because the claim only science gives us knowledge itself cannot be proven by science.
That's the problem, that you cannot prove that science is true using scientific method.
That's it.
Because it's illogical to use this thing itself to prove itself.
That's it.
That breaks the rules of law. That's a tautology. It's scientific because it's scientific. No, that's no good. And you're trying to prove the scientific method. No, you take it on faith.
Yes.
It's good faith, isn't it?
Yes. Well, here's what I would say also in addition to that is that that statement itself, only science gives us knowledge itself, that's not a scientific statement. That's actually a philosophical statement about what science is. You see, so a lot of times what these new atheist types will do is maybe they're very well-established experts in their field, biology, let's say.
Good biology.
But they step outside of that and become amateur philosophers and make these kind of mistakes.
And we had Dr. Edward Facer on a few weeks ago, maybe a couple months now, and he was also talking about how superficial the atheists tend to be in analyzing the arguments for faith in God. They read a summary of the argument, but they don't read Thomas Aquinas or Aristotle themselves. And that's a big problem, because when you argue with them, you're arguing with superficial analysis.
Yeah, that's 100%. I used to teach philosophy of religion, so I've seen a lot of the philosophy of religion, by the way, for people who don't know, is the philosophical study of these questions, using reason to determine what can we know about God, if anything, and so on. So that's under that rubric of philosophy of religion. And a lot of those college textbooks will approach this topic this way, in a very biased way. Here are the arguments for God, and they'll give them in a very sort of taken out of context, very short summary versions of them. And then here's how David Hume refuted them. Here's how Immanuel Kant refuted them. And let's just move on. That's basically how it's presented. And I think it's very unfair. So when I taught philosophy of religion, of course, we would spend a lot more time on the actual arguments themselves. We would go into those philosophical objections raised by people like David Hume and Immanuel Kant. But then I would also go on and say, well, here's how other philosophers have responded to Hume and Kant. So there's a lot more dialogue going on here. It's not so cut and dry. So I think the mistake that a lot of these textbooks and university teachers make is they treat it very superficially. They set up a straw man to kind of knock down religious belief, and let's just kind of be done with that and move on.
That's right. And instead, what you don't have, and what I urge students to do, is read the texts by these philosophers. Read what they actually say, and not read the summaries of them.
Yes.
That's key. And more importantly, I urge the professors to do the same. Read the texts of Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas. Now, given some of the, what are some of the topics that you try to take on in this series called Christ 101?
Yeah, so Christ 101 is a course that I made. I spent, probably 3 or 4 years on it. And what that's designed to show is that Christ is a divine being by looking at the different historical evidence surrounding fulfillment of prophecy, the resurrection of Jesus, the reliability of the New Testament, things like this. And
well, wasn't the New Testament, though, written so many decades after these? How can they know what happened? They didn't even know Jesus. Isn't that?
That's what many of these skeptics say.
Yeah.
So, of course, we want to tackle all of those objections and many of those misconceptions that are kind of spread out in popular culture through blogs and YouTube videos, things like Jesus never existed, or the Gospels came, centuries after the time of Christ. I mean, it's just absurd things. But people don't know. And a lot of times the university professors who repeat these things, they don't know either. So we make a strong case for Christ in this series. And it's an important one because traditionally Catholic apologetics has had kind of a 3-step structure. A lot of people, when they think of Catholic apologetics, they think about how do we dialogue with Protestants? Where is Mary in the Bible? Where that sort of approach. And that's an important question. Those are important questions. However, that's kind of logically speaking, that's the last part. The most fundamental part of Catholic apologetics is the question of the existence of God, the demonstratio religiosa, that philosophy, human reason, apart from the gift of faith, can show that God exists. That's the most foundational issue when it comes to apologetics, because if God doesn't exist, you can forget Catholicism and everything else.
That's right.
But once we know God exists, we're not quite done yet, because the next logical question is, okay, we know that there's a cause of the universe, a personal cause, that's fine, but the next logical question is, all right, which God is it? Is it the Hindu God? Is it the Muslim God? Is it one of the Nordic gods? You know what I'm saying? So that brings us to step 2 of this traditional Catholic apologetic method, that Christ is that God. This gets into those historical evidences for the divinity of Jesus Christ. And once we know that God exists in philosophy class, and we look at history and see that God has definitively revealed himself in the person of Jesus Christ, then the next logical question is, all right, well, there are a lot of Christian churches out there. Which one of them has the true Christian faith? Which one of those different churches, the First Baptist Church, the Second Baptist Church, whatever, which one of those accurately represents Jesus' true teaching? And that's where we get into step 3 of the Catholic apologetical method, the Demonstratio Catholica, where we show that Christ established one true church, and it still exists today.
In terms of this issue that, again, I hear often enough, where people will say, well, Jesus is, an interesting teacher. He has some good stuff to say. We like what he said, but you can't believe that he's God.
Yes.
I mean, that's the later Christians inventing that. Matter of fact, you have people like, Dan Brown from the Da Vinci Code trying to say that Constantine taught that, whereas in fact, Constantine denied the divinity of Christ.
Right.
Didn't they just make that up? How would you prove that Jesus is a good teacher and yet he's certainly not God? Yeah,
well, that's a common what I call a fence-sitting position that people want to take. They don't want to be opposed to Jesus because he said these great things, but they don't want to go all the way and admit that he's God either. But the problem with that approach is that Jesus didn't just teach nice things. He also claimed things that he was a divine being, that he was going to judge men at the end of time. And if those claims are false, and Jesus himself knew them to be false, and that gets into what we call the trilemma argument. That if
trilemma? I have a lot of dilemmas. What's your trilemma?
Trilemma means 3 options. Jesus was either Lord, liar, or a lunatic. He claimed to be God. If that claim is true, then he's God. If he's wrong about that, then either he knew he was wrong or he did not. If he knew he was wrong and said it anyway, then he was this huge liar.
Yeah.
If he didn't know he was wrong, then he was just insane, right? So those are the three. Those are your real three options when it comes to Jesus: Lord, liar, lunatic, and that's pretty much it.
Yeah, yeah. And that's, see, use that
Logic.
nice way to do logic. And, well, where do you come down then? How do you decide that he's telling the truth?
Yeah, well, you look at the different evidences for the Christian position. And this course that I made, I didn't want to leave any stone unturned. I really did. I didn't want to treat it superficially, but I didn't want to get too deep and be an egghead academic either. So I wanted to make it for everybody. So I think I kind of struck a good balance. I tried to strike a good balance there. To be, academically engaging and challenging, yet not too simplistic. Yeah. And so we go into some deep detail there, but I hope I didn't overdo it.
Yeah, no, you did a great job. But I think it's important for folks here in the audience to see, if you're going to argue that he's not a liar, how would you do that? How would you prove that he's not a liar or a lunatic?
Yeah, well, there are some people take this approach a different way. Most people don't want to say that. Again, they don't want to be so opposed to Jesus. So I just like to, for my own personal evangelization efforts, I just like to lay those options out there. Look, this is what it comes to. Either you're saying Christ is God, or he's this huge liar. Even though he taught all these great high moral truths, you're going to have to come down and say that he's this, vicious person.
And that's where
most people don't want to go that far. So I'm okay with just leaving those options out there and kind of just exposing that position.
Because I think it's important to say that, does he act like a liar? Where is he lying? Liars don't usually tell one lie, because once you start to lie, you're like a character in Macbeth. It just has to keep on getting more and more because you're covering up one crime and you got to do another crime and so on. And that's usually the way. And he doesn't sound like he's lying. He's not coming up with lots of different stories.
He died for the belief,
Yeah.
They didn't crucify him just for being a peace-loving hippie. I mean, obviously he made some dramatic claims.
That's right.
So liars don't make good martyrs.
No, and he doesn't quite sound crazy either. There's a depth that his ideas have, that the more you follow those, the deeper a person you become. When you follow the ideas of lunatics or people who are mentally deranged, you become deranged.
That's right.
You do deranged things.
Yes.
And that doesn't fit,
right.
What you see here. So he doesn't act like a liar or a lunatic at all. He acts like someone who tells the truth and rather be dead than not tell the truth.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
What are some of the other big issues that you need to
So that's one course that we made. It's been a very popular one, was the Christ 101 program. I've also produced courses on that first issue, the existence of God question. That was my field of study when I was doing graduate work in philosophy, were these philosophical arguments for the existence of God, because that really does set the stage. Once you can know through reason alone that there is a God that is one immaterial and personal creator and designer and ground of moral obligation, once you know that, then you've really dramatically changed the landscape now for a lot of people, right? You're out of the atheist worldview now, and now you're into a theistic worldview. A world where there is a creator, and that raises that next logical question. Okay, well, has he given me anything else? Has he revealed himself in any particular way? And that leads right into Christianity. So these philosophical arguments for the existence of God, I think, really are a segue. They open the door to Christian apologetics.
What would be one of the most common questions you or attempts to trip you up to say, well, you can't prove God exists? Show me something.
Yeah. So that's commonly said. That's just asserted. And what I usually do is just lay out one of these traditional arguments for the existence of God. Such as the first cause argument. Are you probably familiar with that one? It's the most common one in the history of philosophy. And it starts with the idea that when we look into the world, we see that there are cause things. That is, things that depend on something else
So
their
that
existence.
you didn't create yourself. You came from your
I
parents.
depend on things like water and food and warmth.
Right.
So there are effects in the world, things that depend on other things for their existence. And that's sort of the starting point for this argument. And so people like Aquinas will say, all right, well, could everything be like that? Could it be the case that everything that exists in turn depends on something else for its existence? And after a little philosophical reflection, we can say, no, that's absurd. That's impossible, because if that were the case, then nothing would exist at all. Take, for example, something. Let's just call it thing number one, right? And we ask, why does this thing exist? Well, under this hypothesis, it would be caused by something else, right? Say, thing two. But notice we have not adequately or sufficiently explained the existence of thing one, because thing two would also have to be caused. So one and two would have to depend on something else, thing three. But if thing three is also caused, do you see the problem? Yeah. Just adding in cause things doesn't make any progress to fulfilling the needed requirements for the existence of this first thing or the second or the third. It would be like trying to explain the movement of a train caboose on a track by saying it's being pulled by a boxcar. Right? Why is this caboose moving? Well, a boxcar is pulling it. Well, both the caboose and the boxcar need something else, right? Neither of those things can move by themselves. Well, that's another boxcar. You see, just adding in boxcars doesn't sufficiently explain the motion of these cars on the track. You would need something that could move by itself, something that does not depend on something else for its motion, something that would in turn cause the motion of everything else on the track. And in the same way, in reality, you would need the existence of something that exists by itself, a first cause, an uncaused cause that would in turn explain the existence of everything else. And further philosophical argumentation can show that this first cause must be one, immaterial, and personal. And since that's what most people mean by God, that's one way reason can show that God exists.
Yeah. And it's ultimately a fairly simple approach, but it's something that even a man as brilliant, who Stephen Hawking, who just died, Hawking just passed away yesterday.
Yeah.
He just believed that the Big Bang, which is a good theory. The Big Bang is a good theory for the universe exploding and continuing to explain its expansion. But Stephen Hawking said, well, whatever it was that started about the size of, I think he said about the size of a baseball or a golf ball, was the whole universe, but it was extremely dense. It just was. Well, that doesn't make sense because that changed. Yes. That changed.
Yes.
What made it change?
Yes.
Nothing can make itself change by itself.
Yeah.
Something had to make it change.
St. Thomas Aquinas has a similar argument. His first way, which is this argument from change. And so, that's kind of what you're getting at. There would be this potency here to be actualized, but something actual would have to come along and actualize that potency.
This tiny little ball that became the whole universe could do that. It had the potential to become all the planets and stars.
Yes.
But it couldn't do it by itself. Yeah. It only had the potential. Something else had to make it move.
Yeah, and I would just add to that too, Big Bang cosmology is a relatively recent discovery, just in the 20th century, right? So, but I myself, I don't get onto this track of always needing modern science to do my apologetics. Like, oh, we have a new scientific proof now, implying that the old proofs don't work. We have solid, sound philosophical arguments for the existence of God that go centuries back to the time of Aristotle. And these are still solid, sound arguments, in my opinion, that have never been sufficiently answered. And so I don't want to give people the impression that we kind of have to wait around for science to tell us that it's okay to believe in God.
That's right. No, the argument is there. It's just that modern science corroborates the old arguments.
That's it,
The arguments are ideas of human thought. Aristotle came up with these arguments without modern science. But he had the thought. And just because he's old doesn't mean that he's not telling the truth.
That's right.
Remember that when you look at me. All right, we have to take a break. We're going to come back. We want to get some of your questions. If you have some questions, somebody in your family who's left the faith and says, I don't believe in God and all this, and they tell you why, and you want to ask about that, this is a great time to do so, as well as getting these DVDs. So we'll come back in a couple of minutes with your questions and questions from our studio audience. So please stay with us. First, I want to let you know, I was at the EWTN Catholic Radio Conference this past year. I had a great time. I really enjoyed it. And I also want to let you know that you can watch the highlights from the 2017 EWTN Catholic Radio Conference. It's going to be this weekend. We have this program called EWTN On Location. It's going to air on Saturday, March 17th. So that'll be St. Patrick's Day. But on March 17th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And again on Sunday, March 18th at 3 a.m. Eastern Time. For more information on the next conference for Catholic Radio, just go to the website, EWTN. CatholicRadioConference.com, and that's a good thing. We'd love to see it. It was a lot of fun. I met some great folks, and they're doing wonderful, wonderful things all over the country. Also, you know, today's death of the atheist Stephen Hawking, 76 years old. He's amazing. He really was amazing. He was brilliant, but he lived with ALS. This is what we often call the Lou Gehrig's disease. Lou Gehrig, the great baseball player, had it. But Hawkins lived with it for 55 years. He was the longest survivor of ALS. You know, he lived longer than anybody known in history. And that's just astounding. And not only did he live with it, he didn't just survive. He really used his intellect, which was a wonderful intellect, and did lots of fine thinking. He just left one problem of where did the initial material of the Big Bang come from? He didn't quite, he just said it was. That's not a good enough explanation, but what he explained about everything else was absolutely brilliant. Are you ready for some questions?
Ready when you are, Father.
Come on, let's get started. We'll start off with Thomas, who's in Tennessee. Thomas?
Hello, Father.
Hi, where in Tennessee are you?
Kingsport.
Go Kingsport. Good to have you back again. What is your question, Thomas?
Well, my question is for Dr. Sullivan.
Yes.
And I was wondering if he had any thoughts as to why St. John Paul II's teachings and writings were so deeply rooted in Thomistic thought.
All right, so why was he so rooted in Thomistic thought?
Well, for one, St. John Paul II was a good Catholic, and the Catholic popes throughout the centuries have always recommended Aquinas as the premier Catholic philosopher. I actually had a friend, when I was in grad school, I had a friend of a friend who met John Paul II as Pope. And he asked John Paul II and said, Holy Father, are you a Thomist? A Thomist. And John Paul II said, a good Pope has to be a Thomist.
There you go. There you
so
go.
no, he did obviously philosophy in Poland. He was trained in a particular branch of the thought of Thomas Aquinas called Lublin Thomism, which is just the variety of Thomism that kind of flourished there in his area of Poland. But yeah, I think he just adopted the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas for the best reason anybody would do that, because he thought it was true.
Yeah. Yeah, Lublin University has a great faculty of philosophy and has for centuries. And he also was studying at the Jagiellonian University in Kraków, Poland, which is one of the oldest in Europe. And so he had a good background. And in those days, all the priests studied Thomas Aquinas in seminary. That was the norm. So a required norm. Pope Leo XIII had forced every seminary to teach Thomas Aquinas. Unfortunately, that broke down at a time when I was going through. We didn't learn Thomas, unfortunately. It shows. All right, let's now go to someone in our studio. Sir, where are you from?
I'm here from Arlington, Texas.
Arlington, good to have you here. And your question?
Dr. Sullivan, we have a 18-year-old boy. From the time he's 5 or 6 years old, he went through Catholic school, and he's ready to graduate and head out into the university, which fills us with a heavy dose of fear. From your teachings and just from the videos that you have, what would you have to further help to guarantee that he might stay within his faith?
Yeah, and it's good that you're concerned about this. And I would say that, of course, it's not too late. He's still solid in his faith. What happens, what I get a lot of times is parents who have said, I hear this all the time, that my child went off to university and now they're an atheist. I mean, their stats show that the #1 reason kids leave the Catholic faith, and it is an alarming number, is because they are falling into agnosticism or atheism. So prevention is way better than trying to cure it after the fact. So yeah, I would recommend, obviously I have courses on this. I cover every one of those 3 levels that I talked about. So I got courses on the existence of God, the divinity of Christ, and the authority of the Catholic Church. I also have I do podcasts all the time on these topics on my website. Those, of course, are free. You can come by and check those out. Yeah, I would start there, and obviously I think doing it now would be a good idea to prevent any problem in the future.
And something I would recommend, buy this for his even before graduation. And don't say, son, you ought to watch this. No, watch it with him. And say, son, let's learn this together. That would be a much better thing for parents to do, I think. Have parents sit down and study this with their child, and that you do this as a project together.
Have some popcorn.
Yeah. And if he does well, you can graduate beyond popcorn to caramel corn. All right, let's go over to Bianca. Bianca, where are you calling from?
San Antonio, Texas.
San Antonio, the Republic is speaking. And so, what is your question?
How about defending the Catholic Church to Catholics who are ignorant about their own faith?
Yes.
Does that ever happen?
Well, do you ever try that, Bianca?
Yes.
But it doesn't sound from the sound effects you're giving us here. It sounds like it's going down the drain.
Yes, sir.
All right, Bianca. Let's see what Dr. Sullivan has here to say about that.
Yeah, that's obviously a huge problem nowadays. There are many Catholics who don't know their faith, and B, don't really care. So typically, that's usually the biggest problem, is this apathy. And apathy, you need prayer and fasting to deal with this one. It can be a huge problem. One of the things that I try to do intellectually to deal with an apathetic person, someone who doesn't care about religion, they don't care about the Catholic faith, they just want to go have fun, is try to show how religious questions are ultimately tied into their happiness. And that's actually one of the things I do in this Christ 101 course, is show that a religious issue is not just some abstract thing that you can take it or leave it, that you don't need to think about. Because actually religious questions are intertwined with questions regarding your own happiness, and everybody's concerned about that.
Yep.
So I always start there.
That's a good way to deal with the apathy. And the other thing too, Bianca, obviously I've come across this.
Really?
Yeah.
A couple times?
A couple times. And one of the things that it challenged me to do is when I hear these questions, I say, that's not right, but I didn't always know precisely why. And the great thing about being a Catholic is I can go and find out an answer because there is an answer. And every time, I'll never forget, one of the students, I was a grad student at Vanderbilt, and one of the seminary students there, Protestant seminary students, oh, you Catholics didn't believe in the Mass as a sacrifice until the 4th or 5th century. I said, that's not right. And after he said that, he'd walked away. I was sitting at my carrel in the basement of the library, and I looked up and I saw a Protestant book called The History of the Doctrine of the Eucharist. So I went over there and read it. And this Protestant scholar said, every single father of the church from the 1st century forward, including the New Testament, believed that the Mass is a sacrifice and the real presence of Christ. This Protestant scholar was showing that. He didn't necessarily like it, but that's what it was. Sure. And so this is what you do, Bianca. Let that be a challenge for you to learn more about your faith, and there are answers, and then write them down because they come up again and again. So that's an important thing. All right, ma'am, where are you from?
Cape Girardeau, Missouri.
Cape Girardeau, that's a nice town. I haven't been there in a long time, but I enjoyed it. The last time I was there, it flooded. Hopefully it's in better shape.
Oh, no, we're getting probably, water's going up again.
Okay, well, they won't blame me this time anyway. So what is your question?
Well, it's kind of the same thing, except we have a family member. He's probably about 10 years younger than I am, so he's older. I grew up Catholic, and he's just very smart, scientific, uses scientific as excuses, but he won't talk to us about the faith anymore or anything that has to do with it. He doesn't want to approach us, but he's I don't know if he considers himself agnostic, atheist. I'm not quite sure what he even considers himself. I just know he doesn't want anything to do with religion per se. So I was just kind of curious.
Well, it sounds like not only does he not want to have anything personally to do with religion and the faith, he also doesn't want to bother talking about it. Would that be? I think perhaps, and this is just a wild guess because obviously I've never met him, that he may have had some bad experiences. I know a lot of, I was one, an agnostic, atheist, who have tried to dialogue with religious people, and they'll say things that are very off-putting to an intellectually minded person. They'll say, well, it's just blind faith. And I'm sorry, that's not going to work for an intellectually minded person. So what I'm saying is he may have had some bad experiences trying to discuss this topic rationally. So he just said, you know what, I'm done. Yeah, Mom, that's nice. And so what maybe be your in is to learn, like you just said, learn some of this yourself, learn some of this philosophy, the philosophical, some of the intellectual stuff behind the faith, and approach him with that and see if that doesn't just start a little fire there. Maybe it just catches his ear for us, that catches his attention, in other words, and see if that doesn't sort of at least rekindle his interest in the discussion. Forget hitting a home run the first time you're up to bat, but you just want to get on base. Can you just get him talking about it? What do you think of this? Show him a copy of this program on YouTube. What do you think of that? And see if you can't start getting to talk about these things. And now the door is open. Even if you lose the first time, don't lose heart. You can come back the next time, go home and study some more. But at least now the channel of communication is open again. That's what you need. Another
thing, too, that could be a little bit of a help or an interesting point. You can mention, for instance, that the scholar who came up with the Big Bang Theory was a Catholic priest, Father Georges Lemaitre. I think he might have become a Monsignor. And, he convinced Einstein that the theory was true. Einstein didn't like it, even though he was using Einstein's theory. And they used to go for long walks together and discuss these things. They were, I think, in California, refugees from war-torn Europe. And Georges Lemaitre, said, did you, just ask him, did you ever hear about that priest that convinced Einstein that the Big Bang Theory is true?
Yes.
That, is something about science. Now, read up on Georges Lemaitre. You don't have to know the whole Big Bang Theory. That's a complicated approach. But you might intrigue him by asking him, have you heard about this Georges Lemaitre and how he convinced Einstein, and he was a priest that did that? Do you know anything more about it? Can you help me understand him better?
Yeah.
That's
sure.
another good come on. All right, let's take another caller. We have Carol on the line. Carol, where are you calling from?
Hello?
Hi, where are you from?
Oh, I'm live. Yeah, I'm calling from Michigan.
What part?
The UP.
UP. Now you're talking cold up there.
Yeah,
cold
it's cold
and snow.
out today.
So what's your question today, Carol?
I have a question in regards to Kant and his critiques of Thomas Aquinas. I have a brother who does not believe in natural law like Aquinas did. And could you just briefly explain, if you possibly could, Kant's critiques of Aquinas and how one can refute what Kant said and support Aquinas?
Interesting approach. So folks understand, Immanuel Kant was a philosopher in the 18th century, early 19th.
German.
And he was a German, and he wanted to maintain faith in God, but he did it in a way that was odd because he didn't believe in the natural law as explained by Thomas Aquinas and some of the other bases of metaphysics that underlie that. So,
yeah, she mentioned natural law. I don't know that Kant criticized Aquinas and people like him on this topic of natural law. He did say something about philosophical arguments for the existence of God, like the one I gave earlier on. I actually go into depth on Kant's Kant's objection in one of my courses. I call it How to Prove That God Exists, the Thomistic Cosmological Argument. But nevertheless, what Kant said was about this was just plain wrong. It's just not true. He thought that all of those first cause type arguments like I gave, notice that I started with a fact in the world. I said that in the world there are things that are caused by other things. So the starting point is the actual world.
Physical
There's
world.
a different kind of argument for the existence of God called the ontological argument that starts with a concept of God. It's from St. Anselm, and other philosophers have picked it up too. And I'm not going to get into all the merits of that argument, but what Kant argued was that the first cause argument really depended upon this ontological argument, and it's just simply not true. Aquinas was opposed to the ontological argument. He didn't think you could start with just the mere idea of God and therefore show that God exists because God is the greatest conceivable being. And if you try to imagine the greatest conceivable being and then say that being does not exist, well, then the greatest conceivable being is not the greatest conceivable being. Something else could be one you conceive of that is existing. It's kind of complicated. But Aquinas didn't like that approach. So I think Kant was just wrong in his critique of the first cause argument on this score. I go into some more detail on this topic in my course. But that's what I know of Kant when it comes to critiquing Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah, you may want to get that course. And again, don't just give it to your brother. Watch it with him and study this as well so that you have a sense of working through these ideas of great philosophers. And don't think it's irrelevant. The ideas of Immanuel Kant had a huge impact on practically every modern philosopher. Everybody's dealing with him where he kind of wants to be inside his mind.
Yes.
And everything is in his mind. And whether it's Sigmund Freud or Carl Jung or whether it's other philosophers, the moderns are all dealing with Kant.
Yes.
And this is an important issue. Is everything in your mind? And you hear that from students.
Yeah.
Everything's in your mind, or is it based in the real world around us?
And I think part of our postmodern world is a sort of ripple effect, even from people like Kant.
Yep.
That's what we're living in. Some of the effects we're living in today.
Philosophy sounds like it's so up in the air. What are you talking about? But it has big effects, even on people like Nietzsche, who had a big effect on people like Adolf Hitler.
Or her son.
Yeah, well, we'll go to the extreme. But this is very important to see these ideas have big impact on the way Karl Marx thought. Yeah. Big impact. So that's why we study them, because they lead people to dumb ideas that become evil actions, as with Marxism. Let's go over to Lori. Lori, where are you calling from?
Bristol, Connecticut.
Great, welcome. And your question?
Yes. I find that a lot of times I have to evangelize or use apologetics with my own Catholic friends, because a lot of my friends believe that the loaves and fishes story was everybody shared their lunches. And
I'm sorry.
Yes, I know Mother's turning it over in her grave. Anyway, and also, when I go to hear religious women speak, I hate to say it, it breaks my heart, but here with this whole group here and all this religious soaking up this talk, and they were saying the only reason the Blessed Mother said her Magnificat was because she was so happy that God came to overturn the system. And they try to make her out to a political figure. And Father Mitch, maybe you could explain why we don't hear more preaching about the difference between critical judgment and rash judgment. Because I'm told I'm rash judging.
Wait, you're rash judging because of them saying that Our Lady was a revolutionary? I mean, I'm not so sure who is doing the rash judgment here. By the way, let me just give you a little story that I have about, I'll let you take that question about this difference between rash judgment and rationally judging.
Okay.
But this little story about the loaves and fishes. I told that interpretation to the Bishop of Nazareth in the Holy Land. And he just got upset. He said, Abuna, these people do not know us. If I had 10 children and 1 piece of bread, and a man comes to my house, he will eat, and we will go hungry. The idea that they would hide food is a projection by the scholar who came up with that in 1814, as well as the projection of the preachers who are saying that. They may be selfish, but the Middle Easterners share their food. But readily.
Yeah, I didn't get quite all the details.
So in other words, because people are saying, because she criticizes those who are telling them that Our Lady is a political revolutionary. She's called rash, doing rash judgment. Okay. How do you distinguish that between rational judgment?
One of the important things we do in logic, and I say this all the time, is whenever you are in a discussion or a debate with someone, the absolute first thing you have to do is define your terms. Right? Yes. People argue about evolution. Evolution is a fact. No, it's not. What do you mean by evolution? You see, so in this case, if someone's saying that you're guilty of rash judgment, what do you mean by rash judgment? You know what I mean? So this is where I think some people think of logic the way they do of philosophy in general. It's this academic, heady subject that doesn't really involve me. Yeah. But the fact is that we are all rational creatures. We all have to be logicians to some degree. You couldn't get through the day without thinking logically. It's just, are you going to be good at it or not?
Yeah.
And you get good through training.
Yep. We're running right out of time, I'm afraid. Also, make sure you have them read the actual words of the text rather than emphasize their interpretation. I urge you strongly to get Dr. Scott Sullivan's video series, Christ 101, The Evidence for Christianity, and Logic 101, both are multimedia. They're 10 DVD sets. They're wonderful. I looked at them myself. Go to EWTNRC.com or call our catalog 1-800-854-6316. You'll learn a lot. Thank you, and may the Lord bless all of you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. I'm so grateful that Dr. Scott was able to be here with us, but we can do it only because this network is brought to you by you. You make it possible, so keep us in between your gas bill, your electric bill, and your cable bill, and we'll pay our bills too. Thank you.